Yes, yes, my soul says yes, 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 good morning, yes, yes. Good morning, good morning. I would like to thank you for joining me today. Good morning. Welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. And I would like to thank all of you for listening, my driving listeners. I like to say I am your live audio for those of you who are driving and listening. And I want to also thank my We Dare squad. Thank you all for being in the room consistently, and thank you all for your support financially. Those who give to the broadcast on a monthly basis. I also want to thank those of you who are watching by YouTube live stream. I want to thank those of you who are watching by your laptop as well. And of course, I want to thank those of you who are streaming on Twitter and also are viewing through Facebook. So, the wonderful thing about technology is that it bridges the gap between space and time. All right. So I do have a treat for you today. I found it interesting that all of last night, as I was kind of drifting in and out of sleep into this morning, my spirit and my mind kept singing the Yes song by Shekinah Glory. And, the words to that song are very simple. And it says, if I told you what I really needed, would your heart and your soul say yes? And if I told you what was required of you, would your heart and soul say yes? And so I want to just pose that question to you today as we are going into our Teachable Tuesday. Are you saying yes? Have you given God a complete yes today? Are you doing the things that God requires of you? You know, one of the things I have realized as a leader is that there are certain things that God is requiring of the leaders that He's not requiring of those who follow the leader, to be quite honest and to be quite frank. And sometimes we as leaders can impose our particular restrictions, okay, for our calling. Sometimes we can impose that on others and we become legalistic and we bring people into a measure of bondage because they're trying to follow our prescription that God has given us for living. All right. And I'm not talking about the principles of the Word of God. I'm talking about there are specific things that sometimes God calls leaders to do that He does not call those who are following them to do. All right. And so I don't want to be that person. All right. I don't want to be the person who is putting guidelines on people that God never put on them, number one, and that they were specific to my call and the things that God has set for me to do. All right. So I just want to give that little nugget this morning. We're going to be looking at immigration again. And before we look at immigration, I do have a wonderful book I want to share with you. We'll probably start it today and maybe, Lord willing, finish it next Tuesday. This is called Heart and Soul. It's by Kadir Nelson. If you aren't familiar with Kadir Nelson, I actually personally, as a fellow artist, I love his work. I love his paintings. I love he's done several picture books for children. And this is partly his story. And he interweaves in history all throughout his story while including people specific to his own family, which is pretty cool. So I want to read a little bit of this to you. I read it from the library and then I enjoyed it so much that I went and got my own copy because it does have some historical pieces running all the way through it, and those historical pieces are accurate. All right. So if you're looking for a book that is not too gory and things of that nature, and you want to gift a book maybe to a child between the ages of 7 and up, this would actually be a really good book because it follows the history of African Americans to the present, from the past to the present, but it also weaves in a storyline to it. So that being said, I want to get into it, and then we will probably stop at a good place, and we will go into our piece on immigration. I want to make sure we spend most of the broadcast on that subject because, again, the way that immigration was set up in this country does matter to the Black American and to the African American experience. So we need to understand the history surrounding immigration. And when people say things to us like go back to Africa, we need to understand that we have a choice to go back. All right. We do. We have a choice to go back. Africa is rich in resources. That's not an insult for someone to tell you to go back to Africa if you understand, as we talked about yesterday, if you understand Africa, that it's a continent with many countries and lots of resources that other nations are still trying to get their hands on and mine and excavate to this day. All right. But if you don't have that understanding of Africa, if you only have the understanding of starving children and disease and war and swollen bellies, because that's the images that America loves to show us. They don't want to show us anything else, right? If those are your only understandings of Africa, then of course you would see that someone telling you go back to Africa is an insult. All right. So let's get into Heart and Soul, the story of America and African Americans. All right. So I'm going to try to hold this the correct way for you all to see while I'm reading, and we'll see how well that works out. All right. So here is Kadir Nelson's work. All right, as an artist. And he starts out by saying, most folks my age and complexion don't speak much about the past. Sometimes it's just too hard to talk about. Good morning, Lady Judy. Nothing we like to share with you young folk. No parent wants to tell a child that he was once a slave and made to do another man's bidding, or that she had to swallow her pride and take what she was given, even though she knew it wasn't fair. Our story is chock full of things like this, things that make you cringe or feel angry. Good morning, Lady Apostle. But there are also parts that will make you proud or even laugh a little. You got to take the good with the bad. You have to know where you come from so you can move forward. Many of us are getting up in age and feel like it's time to make some things known before they are gone for good. So it's important that you pay attention, because I'm only going to tell you this story but once. And this is actually one of the pieces that is hanging in the Capitol in D.C. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol, I have been, my husband and I have been on a tour. This is actually one of the paintings on the walls that your congressmen and senators pass by all the time. So they get a visual reminder every time they go through the Capitol of whose land this was. All right. Declarations of Independence. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. George Washington. Ever visit the Capitol in D.C.? It's a beautiful building made of sandstone, and it has a big iron dome that rises over the city like a full moon. It was built by slaves and freemen to be a symbol of the liberty Americans had won from England in the American Revolution. Inside the rotunda, there are large paintings and sculptures of famous Americans, statues of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. The paintings tell the story of how America came to be. Strange, though, and this is strange, and this is something that my husband noticed when he was in the Capitol, and he was, as they were doing the tour, he was standing next to another African-American gentleman, and both of them began to talk about how they could actually hear weeping when we were standing in the in the capital. And strangely enough, there's not one black face in any of those paintings. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about how many black people, millions of black people that were actually in the country at the time. The people were actually building this building, but there's no painting on the wall that depicts their presence at all. Yeah. There's plenty of white folks and a few Indians here and there, but none of us are represented. It's as if we never existed, stricken from the record, like Moses from the walls of Egypt. Of course, those fancy paintings aren't telling the whole truth. Black folks have been here at least as long as Europeans. By the early 1600s, English, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and French settlers had made their way to America and established colonies all along the East Coast. The colonies were a means for European countries to expand their empires and were also a new source of wealth. Each colony produced crops and mined for riches that were sent back to Europe. Africans had come to America as laborers with the Spanish in Florida in 1565, and about 60 years later with the English in Virginia to do the work of building the colonies and producing what was sent back to Europe. So again, historical record, not everybody that came over as a slave. All right. And we now also have evidence that there were people that came before Columbus, that there were Africans that were making voyages before Columbus, that Columbus actually got his seafaring knowledge from the Africans that had already been and that were mapping and doing those types of things. So our history books do not reflect that, which is why you have to teach your children beyond what the school history book tells them. So the labor of these Africans helped to create the foundation of America in its early days. So you see, we deserve to be in those pictures just as much as the Europeans and the Indians. And if you really want to know the truth, we are much of the reason they would later have a chance to fight for their liberty in the first place. By the mid-1700s, the English colonists had been in America for a few generations. They had gained control of most of the settled land along the eastern seaboard. They had set up local governments and made the colonies quite profitable by way of slave-produced crops. Having been in America for so long, many of the colonists had come to think of themselves as American rather than British, and had grown good and tired of living under the thumb of a faraway king. The colonists felt it was time they had a say about how they ran their local governments. They began to talk on the streets, over dinner tables, in taverns, about the king's, unfair taxes. Where have we heard that from? About his nosy soldiers everywhere. Where have we heard that from? And about splitting from England. They talked about not wanting to be slaves to the king. Slaves? What in the world could they ever know about that? The king had taxed the colonists for everything from paint to glass and paper. He even taxed their tea. People in the colonies had finally had enough. To show the king what they thought of his taxes, they snuck out to his boats and dumped all of his tea into the harbor. And that became what we know as the Boston Tea Party. It wasn't long before the king sent more troops over here to try to put people that were in the colonies to put them back in their place. But it only made relations worse, and the colonists became more determined than ever to split with England. In 2 years, there was blood on the streets of Boston. And in one more, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence to cut ties with England. The American Revolution had begun. Now, I find it very interesting that this country was born out of bloodshed and revolution, but yet anytime revolution is mentioned for people who are oppressed, people say, oh, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. Listen, look at the history of your country. All right? Just think on it. There were slaves who fought in that war, but unfortunately, many of them chose the wrong side. By the time of the Revolutionary War, there were more than 450,000 black folks, slave and free, in the colonies. The British had promised freedom to any slave who fought for them. And that was a powerful thing to tell a slave. So thousands of them joined the British. And that's where you have that third stanza in the national anthem where they're disparaging the slaves who wanted to be free, who went to the side of the British who were promising freedom. Okay? General George Washington, who was in charge of the American troops, didn't allow black folks in his army. Let me say that again. At first, General George Washington did not want black people in the army. And I have 3 generations of civil service, military servicemen in my family. All right? He in Congress didn't think it was a good idea to put guns in the hands of folks who might well use them against their former masters or other white folks. And if you think that sentiment has not survived centuries, I don't know where you've been the last 96 hours. Okay? Here is a picture of a Revolutionary War soldier painted by Kadir Nelson. All right? The image of a black man with a gun, even though he was fighting for his country, terrified the white people. It still does today, unfortunately. All right? So, at first, George Washington was like, nah, we good. But Washington changed his mind after he had lost so many of his soldiers to fighting and to the pox, which is a disease. Only then were free black folks and some of the slaves allowed to join his army. General Washington was quickly rewarded by all the black men who signed up to help him gain the upper hand. After 8 years of war, America won its freedom from England, and its citizens were able to manage their own affairs and control their property without having to pay the crown for the privilege. But did we mention that the property included the black people? Both the slaves and free blacks who fought in this war for freedom hoped that the government might free all slaves in the colonies if they fought for them. But the government only freed the people who fought in the army, and slaves who lived in New England states, like Massachusetts, that chose to abolish slavery after the war. Just about everybody else was out of luck, especially many of the slaves who fought for the British. Some left with the British, which was a smart move, okay, rather than go back into captivity and be someone's property, or they fled to Canada. But most went right back into slavery. Now, I can't even understand that. How are you going to fight in a war, fight for freedom, your country gets freedom, but you're expected to go back into slavery? I'm still trying to wrap my head around that, okay? A few years later, America wrote her founding papers, the Constitution. George Washington was made the very first official president, because there were 7 presidents before George Washington. That's a whole other history lesson. And some of them were black. And a new country was born. It should have been a proud moment for everybody. But honey, we didn't have much reason to celebrate. Through the fruits of our labor and our volunteer soldiers, we had helped free America from England, and yet we were stuck in a country that kept most of us as slaves. This is the portrait of President George Washington and slave at Mount Vernon, Virginia. And matter of fact, our ministry is not too far from Mount Vernon. We're about an hour from this place. All right. So President George Washington and slave. All right. Didn't even get a name. What have we got to repent for? I don't know. Chapter 2, slavery. This is a rendering of young Pap, who we're going to be learning about today. All right. Notice young Pap is dressed pretty much in a shirt, and that's about it. Them days was hell. Delia Garlick, former slave, Alabama. Quote, unquote. This may sound funny to you, but my grandfather Joseph didn't allow any of his kin to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day. Even though it's an old African-American tradition, the beans were supposed to bring good luck for the coming year, they say. But Pap, which is what we called him, wouldn't hear of it. When he was a young boy, each New Year's Day, buckets of black-eyed peas were boiled and poured into a horse trough for all of the slaves on the plantations to eat like animals. Pap hated it and vowed that none of his family would ever allow people to treat us that way ever again. Let me just sip some orange juice for all of the people who love to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day. Do I need to come close to the screen? Are y'all still with me? Y'all still with me? You still there? All right. Black-eyed peas was the food for the horses. Pap was the only Africa-born slave in my family. Pap was captured in 1850 when he was only 6 years old and brought to America. Even though it had been illegal to capture and import slaves to America since 1807, it still happened, and very often. On New Year's Day of every year, Pap told us the story. And I believe just either early this year or the end of last year, they found a slave ship. I want to say it was over in Louisiana. I think just the water and tides and all that had finally washed up this last slave ship where some people were still stealing people from the continent. And the evidence of it washed up recently. Okay. So again, even though slavery had the bringing over piece, right? The transatlantic trade had ended. People were still sneaking and getting slaves brought over. That's a whole other history lesson they don't tell people about. So on New Year's Day of every year, Pap told us the story. When I was a child, I would play with all the other children in my village while the grown folks were working far away in the fields. They told us to look out for kidnappers because they were stories of people who went missing. And I want to show you his rendering of the slave ship here. You can see that. All right. Something else that a lot of people don't realize is that these people were stealing mainly boy children. They started bringing women over later, but first they were stealing the male child and bringing them over. Why would I take the children? If I take the children and I separate them from their elders, okay, I can now begin to program the mind of that child and teach them another history. And because they are so young, it'll be easier for me as a slave trader to disconnect them from their history and their past. All right. So he says children were coming up missing. One day when the grown folk were going out to the field, several of those people ran into the village carrying nets and clubs and grabbed me and several other children before we could cry out. They covered our mouths, tied our hands, and ran off with us into the woods. The children were marched for miles all the way to the coast, where a large ship sat out on the water. For days, Pap and many other captured Africans were kept inside a large fort on the beach before they were brought outside and paddled in a small boat to the ship. All right. So understand. Let me see. I got my little miniature globe here. All right. So you're talking about, let's see, the Côte d'Ivoire, which is here, okay? And you're talking about all of this area here was labeled above the coast, above the Ivory Coast was labeled Negro land. All right? So if they were in the interior, okay, and they were captured, many times they were walked for miles and days. All right? Sorry about that. My YouTube video people needs to see it as well. All right? If they were in the interior of the West Coast, they would be marched for days to the slave coast. All right? They would be marched for days to the coast so that they could get into the ships and be taken to the Americas. All right? So here, they come off the coast, they're coming over, and they're taken to the Americas on the East Coast. All right? We know that those ships didn't just go to the Americas, right? They went to the Caribbean islands, they went other places. But I'm trying to get you to think that if they were in the interior, the people they were capturing were not right on the coast. They were in the interior, and they had to walk them to the coast, which is why many of these children, all right, that they were chained at the neck, chained to each other, chained in their arms, chained in their legs. If you can picture them walking miles and miles for days to get to the coast, many of them died just trying to get them to the coast. Okay? So they got to the coast. A boat was waiting for them that sat out on the water. For days, Pap and many other captured Africans were kept inside a large fort on the beach, which one of those is still there. I think it's Fort Elmira, I believe, in Ghana. All right. Before they were brought outside and paddled in a small boat to the ship. Below the deck, African men, women, and children were packed like fish, chained together, crammed into spaces so tight that they could not stand up. It was dark and the air was heavy with the smell of sickness and the cries of women and children. When the ship was full, it set off for America. The trip lasted several weeks. Pap was sold to a planter in Maryland as a playmate for his son. When he reached the age of 7, Pap was sent out to work as a field hand. I could tell you about the life of a slave all day long, but even then you couldn't guess the awfulness of it. Slaves are people who are property of other people and must do whatever they are told. They were bought and sold as one would buy and sell an animal or any other thing. Slaves had no right to property. All right? Slaves had no right to property. They had no right to family. So again, when we talk about family unit and what happened to the black community and what happened to the black family, we have to start with the culprits of people who disrupted family from Africa to now. All right? And we still, as a nation, can't figure out what we have to repent for. Slaves had no right to property, no right to family, no right to come and go as they pleased, no right to read or write, or to speak their own language, or to have a last name, no right to protect themselves, no more rights than that of a horse or a pig. And let's even think about that, because now it seems to me that animals have more rights than black men in this country still. You shoot a dog, you're probably going to jail for about 20 to 40 years. You shoot a black man, you were afraid, and you get administrative leave. All right? Does that need to change? You bet it does. The only right a slave had was to work for his master, and work he did. Every morning the slave driver blew the horn or rang the bell, and the slaves woke up, grabbed a hoe, headed out to the fields. In the summertime, the sun was up early and down late. The air was hot, heavy, and full of mosquitoes. With each strike of the hoe to the ground, the slaves sang to keep time with each other and help ease the hard work. Spirituals were born right there in the field. Singing was the only way to keep from dying inside. Singing was the only way to keep from dying inside. Being entertainers was the only way to keep from dying inside. Pap said it was the saddest thing in the world to hear slaves sing those songs, but it sounded so beautiful. Made him want to cry. Some of those so old songs held secrets too, codes to pass on messages to other slaves right under the nose of the overseer. Like when a slave started singing "Steal Away," folks knew it was time to run away. Or when they sang "Follow the Drinking Gourd," the slaves knew to escape in the direction of the North Star at the foot of the Little Dipper. To ease the trouble of their hard lives, slaves got together and danced on Saturday evenings. Most other evenings they slipped off into the woods for prayer meetings, praying for the day that freedom would come. Since Pap didn't have any blood family on the plantation, older slaves took him in as their own. Before he went out to the fields, he lived in the big house with a woman he called Aunt Hattie, who worked all day under the watchful eye of the missus, cooking, cleaning, sewing, even nursing the missus' children when they needed milk. She raised all 3 of the missus' children. There were about 100 or so slaves on the plantation, and they were always hungry and dressed in rags. Most of them went barefoot because the master didn't give them but 1 pair of shoes a year, and the shoes were not made to last. In the fields, they were watched over by an overseer who rode around on a horse, making sure everyone was doing their work. And honey, that man was mean. To keep the slaves in line, he lashed them with a curling bullwhip that he kept on his shoulder, tied them to a tree, and whipped them in front of all the other field hands. Folks a mile away could hear those awful whippings. It's no wonder so many of the slaves wanted to run away and tried. You may wonder, why didn't more of them fight back? Believe me when I tell you that they did every step of the way. But unlike their fellow Africans who captured them, they didn't have any guns to fight back with, so they fought with their fists and died. They fought over the ocean on slave ships and were shot and drowned. They fought in the fields, in homes, and in factories, where they worked and were whipped, beaten, and murdered. They fought and lost almost every time. It would be a long while before we figured out that we could not win our freedom with our fists alone. We would have to find another way. And if you have not seen Black Panther, that last sentence right there will make a lot of sense when you watch the movie. All right? We're going to stop there in this book, and we'll come back to finish up next week, chapter 3, where he talks about abolition, and chapter 4, he's going to talk about Lincoln and Lincoln's War. All right? So I hope that you enjoyed that. All right? Let's move into our continued talk on immigration. And we have been talking about the Germans, the Irish, and the nativists. We're going to finish them today. And then we're going to go into the Italians, the Jews, and the Eastern Europeans. All right. Last time we talked about the Haymarket riot, which happened in Chicago. And these people, the nativists, were blaming, at the time, they were blaming German labor agitators for the riots that occurred. Let's see if I can show you this picture here. All right. This is kind of one of the images that portrays the Haymarket riot. And yeah, Black people aren't the founders of the riot. Let me just put that in there. All right. Rioting. I can almost say rioting is as American as apple pie. How about that? So some of the anarchists were German. Nativists blamed German labor agitators for the Haymarket riots. On May 4th, 1886, workmen demonstrated in the Haymarket Square in Chicago, protesting the killing of several workers from the day before. Someone had thrown a bomb at the police who tried to stop the demonstration. Several people died and 8 anarchists were convicted in a trial. 4 of them were executed. There was no strong evidence that any of them had thrown the bomb, though. The anti-immigrant reaction was overwhelming. One article called the lead strikers long-haired, wild-eyed, bad-smelling, atheistic, reckless foreign wretches who never did an honest hour's work in their lives. Now, this is how they were talking about each other. These are the people who are now all labeled under the banner of white, okay? And sometimes we have to go back in history and understand, if they were talking like this about each other, then some of the stuff you hear now today should not surprise you, okay? Newspaper editorial said they were Europe's human and inhuman rubbish and venomous reptiles. So when we have somebody with rhetoric saying that Africa and that Haiti are not sending their brightest and their best, let's go back to what our actual newspapers printed about the first immigrants who became the descendants of the white people we see today. All right? They call them inhuman rubbish and venomous reptiles. That doesn't sound to me like they thought that they were the best and the brightest that were coming over here. There's no such thing as an American anarchist, another proclaimed. This connection of radical politics to immigrants continued for decades. By the time of the Haymarket riots, there was a new worry for nativists. Immigrants from England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Western European countries were not coming in great numbers. Instead, after 1870, a flood of Southern Italian, Eastern European, and Jewish immigrants caused Americans alarm. Alarm. Okay? These immigrants were generally poor and uneducated and tended to have what Benjamin Franklin described as tawny skin. They're tawny. All right? Think about that. I want you to think about the fact that the Italians, the Jews, and the Eastern Europeans, to these white people, were too black. They were too brown. Just let that sink in. All right? The people they now accept today under the banner of white, the first reaction to them coming over was that they were poor, uneducated, and too brown. Is that in your history books? I didn't see it in mine. Okay? He described their skin as tawny. They were not considered white. The color of thousands of them differs materially from that of the Anglo-Saxon. This is the beloved Benjamin Franklin talking about the Italians and the Jews and the Eastern Europeans. He said they too brown. They're poor. They're uneducated. We are alarmed. Sounds like the same argument that's being used today, right? He said, the color of thousands of them differs materially from that of the Anglo-Saxon. Warned, here's another guy, Congressman Thomas Abercrombie of, why am I not surprised? Alabama. No one has suggested a race distinction, said Senator William E. Chandler in 1892. We are confronted with the fact, however, that the poorest immigrants do come from certain races. All right? Even the German and Irish immigrants and their descendants, who had finally been accepted in American society, saw the newcomers as foreign and dangerous. Racism was again in full flower. So when people say, why we got to talk about racism, I don't understand why we keep talking about racism. I got a sentence for you. Why we gotta talk about it? This is why. This is why. Because we didn't start the conversation. And the conversation is still going. All right? We didn't start the conversation. We just got born into this conversation that's already been happening. All right? So, this was the same time that the state governments in the southern United States were beginning to pass segregation laws against African Americans. At the same time, the immigrants were coming in and they were saying these people are too brown. They were tightening the measures on the black people that were already here. All right? The calls to restrict immigration became louder than the voices of opportunity and diversity. Somebody needs to write that down if you're taking notes. The calls to restrict immigration became louder than the voices of opportunity and diversity. Now, are we in that right? Excuse me. Are we in that right now? Are the calls for separation and the calls for restricting immigration, are they louder than the voices of opportunity and diversity? And more importantly, who is the head of our country listening to? Is he listening to people who are saying, yes, we need to be for opportunity and yes, we need to be for diversity? Or is he listening to the people who are saying, we've got to restrict immigration. We've got to tighten immigration. We've got to close doors and not open them. So the other Europe arrives. This is an Italian immigrant family, typical of many immigrants in the early 20th century who arrived at Ellis Island about 1910. All right, so let me show you this family as we move into the next section. All right, Italian immigrants. All right. Sometimes people need to be reminded of how their ancestors look coming over here. The day came when we had to go and everyone was in the square saying goodbye. I had my Francesco in my arms. I was kissing his lips and kissing his cheek and kissing his eyes. Maybe I would never see him again. It wasn't fair. He was my baby, remembered Rosa Casatari. She left Italy in 1884 to join her husband, who was already working in the United States. She was one of the millions of Italians and tens of millions of Europeans who immigrated to America between 1870 and 1924. Almost all immigrants came with Rosa's vision. America, the country where everyone could find work, where wages were so high no one had to go hungry, where all men were free and equal, and where even the poor could own land. Now keep in mind, people still don't see us, black people, as equal because they don't see us as people. All right? So just keep that in mind with this time period. Like Rosa, they often left behind children and spouses, fathers and mothers or siblings. Families paid the passage for those they could afford to send who were able enough to begin again in another country. And also like Rosa, many could only come in the steerage, which was the cheapest way to travel by sea. Steerage was famous for its harsh conditions. All of us poor people had to go down through a hole to the bottom of the ship. There was a big dark room down there with rows of wooden shelves all around where we were going to sleep. The Italian, the German, the Polish, the Swede, the French, every kind. The girls and women and the men had to sleep all together in the same room. The men and girls had to sleep even in the same bed with only those little half boards up between us to keep us from rolling together. When the dinner bell rang, we were all standing in line holding the 10 plates we had to buy, waiting for soup and bread. All right, here's another image of the steerage passengers gathering on the deck of the ship Patricia, which sailed from France in 1902. In good weather, the steerage passengers could leave their overcrowded quarters in the ship's hold for some light and air. All right. So I want you to think about this, and I want you to think about the Middle Passage, okay, and how different this travel was from people who came on slave ships. Notice they are dressed. They may be in tight quarters below, but they're allowed to move freely about. They're allowed to go up on the deck and get some fresh air. They're not tied up. They're not chained to anyone. All right? They don't look sickly. So when someone insults my intelligence by saying slaves were involuntary immigrants, I'm going to rebuke them. Okay? Just, all right? It was not the same travel. Hear me. It was not the same travel. And you should not be allowing people to make it the same, because then that minimizes the terror and the trauma of what actually happened to your ancestors coming over here. Let me keep reading. When she arrived in the New York harbor, like most immigrants, Rosa waited aboard her ship. She did not come through Ellis Island. That famous immigrant processing center was not open until 1892. She came through Castle Garden, an old fort at the tip of Manhattan that had been turned into an entry point in 1855. The inside was a big, dark room full of dust, with fingers of light coming through from the ceiling. That room was already crowded with poor people from earlier boats, sitting on benches and on railings and on the floor. And to one side were a few old tables where food was being sold. Down the center, between two railings high up, men were sitting on stools at high desks, and we had to walk in line between them, those two railings, and past them. What is your name? Where do you come from? Where are you going? They shouted. Welcome to America. Now, I found that to be funny because when I moved to Virginia, those were always the questions we got. Who are you and why are you here? But we didn't get the third part, which was the welcome to America. We just got who are you, why are you here? Throughout much of the 1800s, state governments, instead of the federal government, were responsible for the entry of immigrants. New York opened Castle Garden to process the huge numbers that came through New York City. In 1882, Congress passed 2 immigration laws. One, because we keep asking, why do we have to talk about race when it's embedded in our history? The first law was in 1882, these 2 immigration laws. Let's look at this first one. In 1882, they passed, for my Asian friends who have, some of them think they're white or have been declared white. In 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited most Chinese people from coming to the United States. So we keep asking, what is our current situations in this nation have to do with race? It has to do with race because that's what they were creating laws based on. All right? So you can't get away from your history when you have encoded your prejudice into your laws. All right? Just trying to help some of us understand, why does race continue to be an issue in our country? You have to look at your foundations. The other, an immigration law for the states to carry out, the other law charged everybody 50 cents to enter the United States. So imagine leaving your country, getting on the ships, getting here, and then you ain't got 50 cents to enter. All right? So certain people, they couldn't even come. They're like, oh no, we're not even letting you in. But it's because it's the law. All right? It's the law for us to not let you in. So I don't know what to tell you. That's just the law, and we have to obey the laws. All right? This is why we said all laws aren't just. Okay? Just because somebody puts something, codifies something, does not necessarily mean it's right. And then you had to pay 50 cents to enter. So if you got there, got ready for processing, and you didn't have your 50 cents, then I guess you would be there trying to earn or figure out how you're going to get 50 cents to be able to leave that entry portal and go into the United States. All right? It was also set, the first restrictions which applied to Rosa, incoming immigrants were to be examined. Wait a minute. Incoming immigrants were to be examined. And if on such examination there shall be found among such passengers as a convict, all right, a lunatic, an idiot, or any person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. Okay. Which was interesting because these were all poor people. Okay. So I'm guessing they meant able-bodied and able to work and earn your living. But they would examine you. Do you have a criminal background? Are you possibly a lunatic or an idiot? All right. Back then that was like mental health issues. Okay. And can you support yourself? These were some of the requirements as they examined you coming in. What I find to be very ironic is that they were examining the people who were coming in for these things, much like our government today is doing. All right. They want to examine these things, but we're not paying attention to the mental illness problem of the people who already live here. Yeah, we're not paying attention to the people who have the potential to get their hands on guns who already live here. We're so worried about foreign terrorists that we're not paying attention to domestic terrorists who are shooting up schools in white neighborhoods. Let me add that. Okay, go look at the map, the demographics of where the school shootings are happening, and you will find they're happening in white communities, predominantly white communities. But we're concerned we got to get these ISIS terrorists, but we're not paying attention to the mental health of the people who already are here and live here. So you had to be able to be here and be able to take care of yourself. It says such persons would not be permitted to land. A public charge was someone who could not support himself or herself, but needed money or help from the government to live. All right. These were the initial requirements. Rosa passed the examination, but American-born citizens from desirable backgrounds like the English and Irish and German now viewed immigrants like her and those from Eastern Europe as intruders. Numerous complaints have been made in regard to the Hebrew Jewish immigrants who lounge about Battery Park, obstructing the walks, reported New York Tribune in 1882. Their filthy condition has caused many of the people who are accustomed to go to the park to seek a little recreation and fresh air to give up this practice. The police have had many battles with these newcomers who seem determined to have their own way. New York's genteel classes might have been annoyed, but American laboring men were furious. During an economic depression that lasted from 1883 to 1886, they were losing jobs. The owners of business and industry brought in contract workers from Southern and Eastern Europe to keep wages down. They're still doing that today. All right. The coal miners in Pennsylvania accused owners who were using the Hungarian and Italian laborers of trying to degrade native labor by the introduction of a class who, in following the customs of their ancestors, lived like brutes rather than human beings. This is the discussion between themselves. All right. During a congressional session, the immigrant workers were described as cattle, large numbers of degraded, ignorant, brutal, foreign serfs. All right. And serfs were kind of like the lowest class of people. Language like this, brutes, as the Irish had once been called, cattle, and degraded, expressed the fear and hatred towards Southern and Eastern European immigrants. In New York and other cities, these newer immigrants lived in their own neighborhoods. This was partly because, so far from home, they drew support from being near people from the same town or village. So do you mean to tell me that even though they may have been able to go anywhere they wanted, all right, they began to kind of cordon themselves off into their own neighborhoods, right? And if you go to New York, right? If you go to New York, you can still see this as evident in how neighborhoods or boroughs are separated. To my understanding, if you go in some of these neighborhoods and you're not invited, you might get yourself beat up. Still today. All right? They became very tribalistic once they got over here because they were drawing support from being near people that sounded like them, that looked like them, that held some traditions back from their old country. They spoke the same language and shared the same religious traditions, but it was also because many Americans did not want them to live in their neighborhoods. All right? When Rosetta Cassatari joined her husband at an iron mining camp in Missouri, life was hard, but the German and English-speaking people who lived nearby were friendly. However, when she moved to Chicago, there were apartments she couldn't have because nobody would rent to Italians. I got stories for days about people in Virginia and how they will not rent to Black people. All right? You go in, you fill out an application, you pay the application fee. You up here, you have to they do a background check on you, they do a credit check on you, and then they say, "Oh, we can't do it. Have a nice day." All right? There are some places where it is an unspoken rule that they don't rent to certain people. All right? We had one realtor that actually let us listen in on the conversation she was having with another realtor. And that realtor said, "We don't want Blacks in this neighborhood." All right? So it does happen. At one point, she and her family lived in a basement next to a factory, One night when it rained a lot, my poor rooms had 1 foot of water in them. The baby's cradle was swimming around, and that basket of clothes I used to wash, it was swimming around too. My husband was throwing the water out with a shovel and sweeping it out with a broom. Southern and Eastern European immigrants were crowded together in poorly maintained tenements or other slum buildings in cities like New York and Boston. The housing wasn't cheap. Landlords knew they had no place else to go. Many of the landlords were also immigrants from the same countries in Europe as their tenants, but they had been in the United States longer. Some took advantage of the innocence and confusion of the newly arrived, guiding them to overpriced lodging and badly paying jobs. So you're new to America. You're thinking, oh man, I'm here. I'm excited. And people are misguiding you to overpriced housing and badly paying jobs. My God. I think I have lived through that. All right. So we're going to stop there. Next week, we'll be back continuing this talk about the Italians, the Jews, and the Eastern Europeans. This has been another Daring Dialogues. I have been your host today. I hope that you have learned something today that maybe you did not know. And yeah, I hope that you've learned something that will encourage you in your walk and how you treat people that come into this country. Let's hope that you're not the person misleading people, all right, and misguiding them. Remember, we talked about 3 things last time that is needed and required for people to do well in this country. That's education, opportunity, and access. Will you be the one today to lead the way? All right. Will you be a Harriet or a Martin or a Malcolm or an Ida? All right. Will you be the person that will lead the way? Will you do something different than the former generations have done? All right. Will you treat people kindly when they come to this country? Or are you going to be the one saying what centuries of people said centuries ago that may have been your ancestors that said, I don't want these people here. They're dirty. They're grimy. They're poor. They're uneducated. Yada, yada, yada. Is that going to be your legacy, or are you going to do something different? All right. So I hope that I've given you something to think about today. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out and be light today. Thank you again for your time and attention. Take care and God bless. And my YouTube live stream viewers, I want to thank you for your time and attention. Take care and God bless.